The roar of laughter echoing through medieval stone halls didn't come cheap, and it certainly didn't come easy. Life as a court jester wasn't the carefree comedy act people might imagine today. Beneath the jingling bells and goofy smiles was a job filled with danger, strategy, and unrelenting pressure. These performers weren't just clowns. They were survival artists in motley colors, walking a razor's edge between comedy and catastrophe. One wrong word, one poorly timed joke, and their next gig might be in a dungeon, or not at all. Medieval kings and nobles weren't hiring jesters just to hear funny noises. If that was all it took, every teenage boy in the kingdom would have been summoned to court. Instead, these rulers sought out something much rarer, someone with the intelligence to entertain and the intuition to read a room faster than a soldier draws a sword. A jester had to make people laugh, but only the right people, at exactly the right time, and in precisely the right way. Getting the job wasn't easy. There was no resume, no letter of recommendation. The audition was your life. Could you sing ballads on the spot? Could you juggle flaming torches while reciting a joke? Could you improvise a rhyme about the king's new tax policy without being executed for it? Then you might stand a chance. Storytelling was crucial too. A court jester might be expected to entertain during long feasts or cold winter nights that dragged on for hours. If you ran out of stories or jokes, you'd better pray someone passed out drunk before the mood turned sour. And then there was mimicry, the riskiest skill of all. The most talented jesters could imitate noblemen so well that guards sometimes confused the real lords for jesters doing impressions. Funny? Yes. Safe? Absolutely not. In a world where mocking the wrong person could get your tongue cut out, this was a high-stakes game of humor and survival. Some jesters trained for years, traveling between courts and perfecting routines. These were the professionals, the niche entertainers who knew how to handle political tension with a punchline. But many others stumbled into the job. Records show that roughly 1 in 4 jesters started out as peasants who just happened to say something clever in front of the right noble. Others were captured in war and given as human gifts wrapped in bells and colorful fabrics, expected to perform or perish. There's also a much darker chapter in this story. People with physical differences, those born with dwarfism, facial deformities, or other disabilities, were often forced into the role of jester. They didn't choose this life. They were taken from their homes and turned into permanent entertainment, paraded through courts like living curiosities. These individuals were laughed at not because they were funny, but because medieval society had no compassion for what it didn't understand. For those who managed to land the job with some actual talent, the risks didn't end there. Being a jester meant living on call, always at the king's whim. If the ruler had a nightmare at 3 in the morning and wanted cheering up, guess who got summoned? Jesters weren't just entertainers. They were emotional support clowns, political lightning rods, and stress relief valves. They had to keep up with palace drama, noble rivalries, and military blunders to avoid offending anyone, especially the wrong person. Most jesters didn't last long. Court records suggest that the average jester lasted just 4 years before being dismissed, running off, or mysteriously vanishing from the scrolls. But for those who survived and thrived, the perks could be surprising. A well-timed joke during a tense council meeting could earn a land grant. Making the king laugh on a bad day might get you gold coins, livestock, or even jewelry. When you're the only person allowed to tease the ruler, you'd better hope your comedy is worth something extra at the end of the week. Once you made it in, your world changed overnight. Your clothes? Think chaotic rainbow with bells. Your bed? Hopefully inside the castle and not too close to the kitchen rats. Your job? Security? Non-existent. But still food cooked by royal chefs, a dry place to sleep, and a regular wage? That beat life as a farmer, no question. In England during the 1300s, a jester could earn between 10 and 20 pounds a year. That was a decent wage, far better than the 2 pounds a common laborer might bring home. But the real value wasn't the salary, it was the bonuses. One jester famously received a chunk of land for making the king laugh during a particularly tense political standoff. The document actually credited him with services of mirth and good counsel. Imagine cracking a joke and walking away with a deed. In Germany, court records tell of a jester who was granted 1 gallon of beer per day for life. That's 365 gallons a year. Whether that made him funnier or just louder remains a mystery, but it's safe to assume he never had a dry performance. Other rewards included gold coins, jewelry, or rare food. That is, of course, if the king liked you. If not, your bonus could be a sudden disappearance, a dungeon stay, or the final honor of performing for the executioner. Salaries varied wildly from court to court. In a wealthy kingdom, a jester might make more than some minor nobles. In a poor household, you might be rewarded with kitchen scraps and a bed of hay in the stables. But hey, sleeping near horses had one advantage. You didn't smell like the worst thing in the building. Small comforts. Yet even with the perks, long-term security was rare. Few jesters managed to save enough to retire. Their survival depended entirely on staying funny, staying useful, and staying alive. They weren't just comedians. They were tightrope walkers in the king's emotional circus, and every joke had the potential to become their last. So you've landed the gig. You're officially the court jester, wearing a mismatched outfit that looks like a paint match exploded, and a hat with bells that jingle every time you move. You've got food, a bed, and a royal paycheck. But make no mistake, you're not lounging around cracking knock-knock jokes. This job is a full-body workout in constant performance, and your life depends on it. A medieval jester was more than a funny guy with a quick tongue. He, or sometimes she, was the kingdom's all-in-one entertainment system. You needed to sing, dance, tell stories, juggle, tumble, play instruments, and mimic nobles without getting your head chopped off. Jesters were the Swiss Army knives of medieval performance. The more skills you had, the longer you stayed off the chopping block. Ballads were just the beginning. These weren't simple tunes. These were full-on musical performances, with improvised lyrics tailored to the day's events or a noble's mood. Jesters learned to play everything, from drums to lutes, often switching instruments mid-performance to keep the crowd engaged. Dancing wasn't optional either. Elaborate routines, sometimes mocking politics or imitating local legends, added a theatrical flair that kept court life from descending into total boredom during long, dreary seasons. Tumbling acts, flips, somersaults, backbends were crowd favorites, especially after a few rounds of mead. Physical comedy worked wonders in noisy feasts, and some jesters were known for signature moves. There's one record of a jester in an English court who did a series of flips so energetic, the queen reportedly thought he'd been possessed by 20 merry spirits. He wasn't. He was just very, very motivated not to get fired. One surprisingly valued skill was animal mimicry. French court documents describe a jester who could imitate 14 different animals, from chickens and goats to wolves and bears. His bear impression was so realistic, legend says that hunting dogs would start barking whenever he did it. If you could make the queen giggle by sounding like a rooster, or convince the court the barn had moved indoors, you had job security, at least for a little while. Puppetry and sound effects weren't just fun. They were tools for survival. With puppets, jesters could tell politically risky stories under the guise of fiction. Want to suggest that a local noble is corrupt? Have a puppet king get robbed by a puppet merchant. Everyone laughs, and the real king gets the message. Storms, sword clashes, fart noises, you name it, a skilled jester could deliver. But their job didn't end with entertainment. Jesters often served as messengers, especially when the message was bad. Raising taxes? Blame the jester's song. War going badly? Let the jester lighten the mood with a tragicomic tale. Delivering brutal news with a smile meant the messenger was less likely to lose their head, literally. Nobles didn't like being told no, and the jester's job was to ease the sting with humor. Then there was the emotional minefield of managing noble moods. When a king was furious, his advisors stepped back, but the jester stepped in. Distracting an angry ruler wasn't just helpful, it was essential. One joke at the right moment could prevent an impulsive execution or a declaration of war. In those moments, jesters were less like comedians and more like court therapists with bells on. Blame was part of the game too. If a noble tripped, it was the jester's fault. If a goblet spilled, maybe the jester's story was too funny. This role as scapegoat allowed nobles to laugh off embarrassment and redirect attention. The cleverest jesters knew when to absorb the hit and when to redirect the joke. They were masters of social chess, always 5 moves ahead, balancing wit with self-preservation. Despite the mockery and public humiliation that came with the role, jesters held a strange sort of power. Because they were the only ones allowed to poke fun at royalty, they often saw more clearly than anyone else at court. They noticed who was rising in favor, who was plotting, who was lying. A jester could say what others could only think, so long as they disguised it in enough laughter. That brings us to the most dangerous and important part of a jester's toolkit: truth-telling. In a medieval court, honesty could be fatal. But jesters had a pass, sort of. They could criticize the king, call out hypocrisy, and highlight injustice, all while making it sound like a joke. It was a tightrope act. Too tame, and the message was lost. Too bold, and the jester became the next tragic tale. Court records across Europe tell of jesters who pushed these limits with incredible boldness. In England, one jester famously performed a dance mocking the king's tax policy, and punctuated the act with a dramatic fart. The crowd howled, the king laughed, and the jester walked away not just alive, but with a bag of gold and a land deed for services of mirth. Noche flatulence literally bought him real estate. In France, another jester once walked into court wearing a straw crown. When the king furiously asked what he was doing, the jester replied, "I'm practicing to be you. You've been acting so foolish, I thought it best to prepare." The whole court went silent. Then the king burst out laughing. That joke supposedly changed the course of policy discussions for months. These moments weren't just funny, they were vital. When everyone else was too afraid to speak up, the jester could say what needed to be said. In some courts, jesters became trusted advisors, not just entertainers. When a ruler needed real insight, he'd turn to the person whose only job was to make him laugh. The king's fool was sometimes the smartest man in the room. Still, this privilege didn't come with a safety net. If a joke landed wrong or a ruler's mood shifted, jesters were fair game. Many vanished from records after offending the wrong person or telling the right truth too loudly. Their names were scrubbed, their belongings scattered, their legacies buried. Success as a jester wasn't about being funny. It was about being funny at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right people. Not every jester had the luxury of a royal court. In fact, most didn't. For every entertainer with a feathered cap and a royal patron, there were dozens scraping by in muddy village squares or noisy taverns. These wandering jesters didn't perform for kings. They performed for anyone who would toss them a coin, or at least not throw a turnip. Their world was tougher, louder, and far more uncertain. Street performers had to win over unpredictable crowds. Marketplaces were noisy, taverns rowdy, and festival goers easily distracted or drunk. One moment, you might get applause for a clever song. The next, you're dodging a rotten apple because someone didn't like your punchline. Wandering jesters lived from joke to joke, carrying everything they owned, performing in any spot that could serve as a stage. Rain or shine, summer or snow, the show had to go on, because not performing meant not eating. Local laws didn't make it easier. Many towns restricted how long masterless men could stay, often just 1 or 2 nights. That meant endless travel, sleeping under carts, in barns, or beside roads. The constant movement wore on the body and spirit. Many jesters died young from illness, injury, or exposure. Some joined groups of traveling performers to share food, safety, and stage time. But that also meant splitting meager earning even among the poor. Expectations were high. A bad act could end in a beating. These jesters had no noble to protect them, no castle walls for shelter. They had to memorize hundreds of jokes and songs, adapt to regional dialects, and learn which topics were off limits in each town. A harmless tale in one village might be a deadly insult in the next. Health was another daily gamble. With no access to clean water, medicine, or proper food, jesters were always at risk. If you were sick, no one paid you to rest. You either performed or starved. Many jesters suffered chronic injuries from physical comedy or stunts. Frostbite in winter, heat exhaustion in summer, blisters that turned to infections. These were daily realities, and dental issues could be devastating. Try making people laugh, with an abscessed tooth, and no access to anything stronger than mead. Back in the castles, life wasn't much healthier. Medieval fortresses were cold, damp, and filled with rats. Drafty stone walls let in freezing air. Fireplaces smoked constantly thanks to badly designed chimneys. Respiratory infections were rampant. Even among royalty, there were no exceptions, jesters included. Royal medical records mention persistent coughs, sinus infections, and chronic hoarseness among court performers. One medieval physician claimed he could identify a castle jester by the sound of his cough alone. Some jesters were even forced to entertain plague victims. Court records from the 1400s mention jesters being sent into quarantine zones to lift spirits. This wasn't a reward. It was practically a death sentence. Most never came back. Humor didn't protect against the Black Death. Neither did wealth. Jesters, like everyone else, drank wine at breakfast because the water might kill them. They ate meat past its prime, and bread mixed with filler to stretch the flour. Laughter was a coping mechanism, and the jokes often reflected the filth and danger of daily life. In fact, much of medieval humor was shockingly dark by modern standards. Poop jokes, death gags, and references to bodily functions weren't considered lowbrow. They were survival humor. When death lurked round every corner, people found comfort in laughing at it. Jesters who could weave comedy from disease, disaster, and despair were highly valued. They weren't just entertainers, they were emotional first responders. But no performance lasts forever. Aging jesters faced a bleak future. With no pension, retirement plan, or social safety net, most found themselves cast aside once their knees failed or voices cracked. Historical records show that over 2/3 of court jesters simply vanished from royal payment books after age 40, the medieval equivalent of old age. Some were lucky enough to stay in the castle in lesser roles, teaching songs to children or serving as informal historians. A few opened taverns or became traveling instructors, but most weren't so fortunate. Some joined monasteries, especially those who had performed in church plays or could read and write. Others became village eccentrics, wise fools, who lived on the outskirts, offering entertainment in exchange for food. A rare handful received small royal pensions. King Henry of England granted one elderly jester £6 a year, enough for basic food and lodging. But such generosity was the exception, not the rule. And perhaps the cruelest twist of all, even the most famous jesters were often forgotten. While kings and nobles had their names carved into stone and their deeds written into history books, jesters faded into obscurity. They were remembered only if someone wrote down a particularly good joke, or if they died in an especially dramatic way. Their entire careers were about creating laughter in the moment. But history doesn't always remember moments. In the end, the medieval jester was a figure of contradictions, ridiculed yet powerful, mocked yet wise, celebrated yet disposable. They danced on battlefields of emotion, politics, and fear, armed with nothing but their wit, their timing, and maybe a puppet or two. They entertained kings, comforted peasants, and helped entire courts survive the crushing weight of history's darkest days. And when they were gone, someone else put on the bells and stepped into the role, hoping to make it through another feast without losing their head. That was the life of a medieval jester. Not just a job, but a survival act.